Hello, I'm Mark Baer. You're watching the YourTown television show, and I'm with Michael Guardino from the Pacific Biological Laboratories, and you're a docent there, and let's explain what that is.
The city of Monterey actually administers Pacific Biological Laboratories. They make the facility open on the second Saturday of every month for free tours. If you would like to go there and explore and learn a little bit more about John Steinbeck, Ed Ricketts, the men's group that later owned the building, you can just go to the Monterey website and then make reservations. They are free, but it's nice to know that you're going to be able to get in because it is a very popular event. But I'm a volunteer. I'm a docent. I know a lot about Ricketts and Steinbeck, and I try to share that with the guests that come in.
And I guess first thing we have to say is Ed Ricketts is the man and Doc Ricketts is the character.
That's true. Ed Ricketts was born in Chicago, came to California with his family, wanted to open up a biological supply company, so he essentially collected organisms, preserved them, sold them to high schools and universities for dissection and study purpose, and that's how he made his living. He was also a writer. He wrote Between Pacific Tides, which was an ecological study of intertidal life, or the littoral zone, along the west coast of North America.
And then how did he and Steinbeck get together? How did that happen?
Well, there's a fantasy story told by Steinbeck, and then there's the real story. The real story is that the junior author of Between Pacific Tides, a man named Jack Calvin, had both John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts together at a party, and they met. But John Steinbeck, being a novelist and telling a more entertaining story, said that they met in a dentist office, which, of course, was fiction.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So, a little bit about you. You were a teacher for many years, and for how many years? How many?
I taught for 36 years, the last 23 of which were at Carmel High School. I taught the sciences, chemistry, physics, biology, and my affiliation with Pacific Biological Laboratories began in 1987 when I heard that there was this man named Frank Wright who was amenable to leading tours of the facility, and I took advantage of the opportunity. I went in. I was fascinated by what he had to say, his personal relationship with Ed Ricketts, and I started bringing my high school students to the lab on an annual basis. We'd go in, we'd read passages from Sea of Cortez, from Cannery Row, and it was nice to be in the place where a lot of those things actually took place.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty amazing, that we have this here. And so let's talk a little bit about Frank Wright and who he was. You wrote his obituary, and he died. He passed away at when he was 98.
98.
Yes, and let's explain to the viewers exactly who he was and what his relationship to the story was.
Frank Wright was an undergraduate at the University of California, Berkeley in 1942. He was a zoology major, but during 1942, it didn't matter whether you were in university, you were still eligible to be drafted, and he was. He was drafted. He was sent to the Presidio of Monterey for induction into the United States Army, and when they asked him what special talents that he might have that would be useful to the United States Army, he said, well, I can type 85 words a minute and I can speak fluent German. And the Army decided that he would be a whole lot more valuable as a company clerk than he'd ever be with a gun in his hand. So he stayed in the Army for about 5 years. He ended up being a staff sergeant, and he was never shipped overseas. He spent his entire enlistment in the United States.
Wow! And then he met Ed Ricketts.
Well, Ed Ricketts was born in 1897, which made him just old enough to be drafted into World War I. But if you were born in 1897, you were just old enough to be, or just young enough to be drafted into World War II. So he was also drafted, and in his induction interview, they asked him what talents he had, and he said, well, I run Pacific Biological Laboratories, and they made him in charge of doing urinalyses and blood types for the recruits who were coming in to Monterey by the thousands every day. So Frank Wright started to work together with Ed Ricketts, and that's how they became friends. Even though Frank was only 22 years old and Ed was 46 years old, they became very, very good friends.
And he was kind of the last person who had seen these, these iconic people alive. You know, he was like one of the last connections with the history. I had the privilege of doing an interview with him about 5-6 years ago for the 100-story project at the Museum of Monterey, and he was old then, but really sharp.
Yes.
Still sharp. Still, his memory was vivid, and still the emotions of that period were vivid to him. Mm-hmm. You know, and he was a great storyteller. You know, that was so. It's just some of the amazing people among us that are here. So what have you learned over the years, kind of going to the lab? Because you probably know a lot more now than you when you started.
Well, I learned a lot from Frank Wright because he told firsthand stories of his relationship with Ed Ricketts. And I try to make my tours of the lab a lot more personal by relaying some of his stories. I actually recorded Frank's life story, and I'm transcribing it right now because, as you said, he really was a fascinating person. And up until the end, he was mentally as sharp as a tack. About the only thing that he lost in his later years was his hearing. But yeah, he was a great storyteller, and to be able to be that connection to the past was unique. And to be willing to lead people through the labs when he really didn't have to was an indicator of his generosity.
Exactly. With Ed Ricketts, let's talk about the sync. The sync test. What was that about that he didn't want to do?
Frank worked with Ed, and he was really impressed with Ed's moral character. And at that time, with World War II just breaking out and the need for many, many recruits, everybody that came through the induction center at the Presidio of Monterey had to go through a urinalysis and a blood type to make sure that they were 1A and not 4F. And all of the lab technicians were completely overwhelmed, and they couldn't keep up with the amount of work that they had to do. And at the end of the day, the other techs would simply pour the urine sample or the blood sample down the drain, and they would pronounce that recruit healthy enough to be in the Army, which Ed Ricketts thought was a horrible way to behave. So regardless of whether it took him a lot of overtime for which he wasn't being paid, he did every urinalysis and every blood type perfectly to make sure that somebody wasn't diabetic or would have some other medical condition that would preclude them from being in the Army. And Frank said that was just one of many indicators of his morality.
I think that integrity is kind of what Steinbeck found in him. He was a kind of a better angel for Steinbeck.
Absolutely. In fact, a lot of people, including Ed Ricketts, noticed that the protagonist in a lot of John Steinbeck's fiction had the same persona as Ed Ricketts. And he appears as Doc Burton in Dubious Battle. He is the Reverend Casey in Grapes of Wrath. Of course, he's Doc in Cannery Row. And being the protagonist, being the good guy, being the moral compass in all those different stories, a lot of people started to take notice that Ed Ricketts was more than just a casual influence on John Steinbeck's writing.
Well, he was kind of the moral center that he didn't Steinbeck had a moral center, but he also looked outside for stronger, it wasn't all his moral character.
True, and Steinbeck and Ricketts were more than the sum of their parts. Uh-huh. Together, they were a unique combination.
And then Joseph Campbell stumbles into the story. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, Joseph Campbell influenced both Ricketts and Steinbeck because of his work with myth and telling a story. And Joseph Campbell and Ed Ricketts actually went to Southeast Alaska together on an expedition in the late 30s, in which Ricketts was trying to explore the intertidal life north of what he had already treated in between Pacific tides. The other example of Ricketts going a little bit further afield was, of course, in 1940 when Ricketts and Steinbeck traveled to the Sea of Cortez and collected intertidal organisms south of where between Pacific tides I had already studied.
So, and then back to Pacific Biological Laboratories. Now, they're related also to the Monterey Jazz Festival. So how did that relationship happen?
After Ed Ricketts died in 1948, the building was vacant for a while. And then an English teacher from Monterey High School named Harlan Watkins bought the building, actually moved into it, lived there for a while. The reason why he wanted to live there was, as a literature teacher, he wanted to share the place with his Monterey High School students. So he would bring his students down, they would read passages from Cannery Row, Sea of Cortez. But eventually he meets the woman of his dreams and decides that he wants to get married. And his wife flatly refused to ever live on Cannery Row because in the early 50s, Cannery Row was a post-industrial wasteland, and nobody wanted to be there. It was the worst part of town. It was
probably didn't smell very good either.
Actually, by that time, the smell had probably dissipated because the reduction of the sardine had ended. The sardines were
so that was already gone by then.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it was a bunch of burned-out buildings, and Harlan wanted to move out. He met Frank Wright, and they devised this plan to make Pacific Biological Laboratories into their clubhouse. And every Wednesday afternoon for many, many years, from 1958 until 1993, they would have a dinner party, and one of the 21 members of the group would be responsible for cooking dinner that night, and the other 20 would simply enjoy it.
Oh, wow. So let's talk about this group a little bit. Yeah, this is really interesting. I remember this, and I'd forgotten that.
Well, the group was kind of a cross-section of friends. A few of them you've heard of. Bruce Aris, the writer and artist from Monterey, was a member of the group, and he was the only other member of the group, other than Frank Wright, who actually knew Ed Ricketts. So those two guys were the connection to the past. However, there were other famous people that everybody has heard of. There were three cartoonists. Gus Arriola, my favorite, who was the cartoonist that did Gordo. And Gordo actually taught me a lot about Hispanic culture because it was a very respectful way for him to relate what was happening in his culture. And another one of the cartoonists was Hank Ketchum, of course, did Dennis the Menace.
Yes.
And then Eldon Dedini, who was Hugh Hefner's favorite cartoonist for Playboy magazine. He also wrote for Esquire and for the New Yorker. So those three guys were members of the men's group. And then, like I said, the rest of the members were a cross-section of Monterey.
Then, so how does this lead to the Jazz Festival?
Oh, okay. In the late 50s, one of the things that the members of the men's group discovered is that they had a common interest in jazz. And one of them knew Jimmy Lyons, who was a DJ up in San Francisco, who was very well connected with the Monterey Jazz Festival. So as the story goes, one of them said, you know, it would be great if we could have a jazz concert here in Monterey. And that was the genesis of the Monterey Jazz Festival, because the members of the men's group were the actual board of directors of the Jazz Festival. And they were able to recruit Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, and a lot of other very famous people for their inaugural jazz festival in 1958.
Wow. So, and then now the lab's been sold to the city of Monterey. So how did that come about?
Well, over the years, members of the men's group started to die off. They started with 21. When they got down to 17, in 1993, they decided that they wanted to find someone to sell the lab to who would make it available to the public. And they looked around, they entertained a couple of offers, very lucrative offers, but rather than taking the $1 million that was offered by one group who wanted to make the building private, they sold it to the city of Monterey for $170,000 or $175,000, which was $10,000 apiece for the remaining 17 members and $5,000 that they put into having a really big party at the end to celebrate the transfer. But Frank Wright did a very clever thing when he sold the building. He put a deed restriction into the bill of sale saying that as long as any of those 17 members was alive, that they could keep their key to the building and they would have access anytime they wanted, provided that they simply called the city of Monterey and gave them a 24-hour notice that they would like to visit the building. And Frank took full advantage of that. He led tours, private and public tours of the lab for a long time. He absolutely loved being there and sharing his stories with other people.
Well, I love you as a science teacher must love that. They glamorize science and the romance of science and the joy and fun and adventure of science. There aren't a lot of Ed Ricketts in the world, and that the legacy goes on, and so it's a really important work that is done there. Now let's talk about the Cannery Row Foundation now, and what are their, in our last minutes, what do they do and what do they need? Because you never know who's going to hear this.
The Cannery Row Foundation has been around for a long time. The directorship passed from Michael Hemp, who's an historian.
Yes.
When he moved up to Gig Harbor, Washington, he was no longer local and couldn't administer the group. So now Greg Caillet, who's an emeritus professor from Moss Landing Marine Labs, runs the foundation. But what they try to do is to make history come alive. And they have tours of Ed Ricketts' lab 4 times a year. And the tours are very extensive. They're 2 hours. He brings in a lot of local historians. They can each chime in and make a contribution. But they are a nonprofit, and what they're trying to do is to just further that knowledge of what was happening in the heyday of Ricketts and Steinbeck. And it's cool too because since Greg Caillet is a scientist, we're able to relate a lot of what was happening in between Pacific tides, which was really a very unique book. It was the first effort to apply the concept of ecology to a marine system.
I'm Mark Baer. You're watching the YourTown television program with Michael Guardino, Pacific Biological Laboratories. And I'm going to show a little bit of a clip of Frank Wright, so stay tuned. Anyway, we'll be back.
I'm Frank Wright, and I was stationed in the Presidio of Monterey during World War II with Ed Ricketts, marine biologist, all-around great guy, great friend of John Steinbeck, not me, Ed was. I never met Steinbeck. But I worked with Ed Ricketts at the Presidio for 2.5 years. And after he was discharged for being over age, he was 47. He was a veteran of World War I. I was about 25, I guess, at that time. Ed Ricketts was University of Chicago and finished enough courses to feel that he could become a marine biologist. And a friend of his struck out for the coast and opened up a biological supply house in Pacific Grove. His friend had dropped out and Ed continued in Monterey. His lab was on Cannery Row at number 800. Well, of course, it wasn't Cannery Row in those days, it was Ocean View Avenue. And that connected with Ocean View Boulevard in Pacific Grove. I got to know Ed very well. We had mutual friends. I was invited down to Ed's lab. The first week I was in the Army, it was a little scary doing that because neither one of us had a pass. And in those days, if you didn't have a pass when you were off the post, well, you were subject to court-martial. It was serious. And you must always remember one thing in the Army: MPs have no sense of humor. And nobody was laughing, but we never got caught. And we walked from the Presidio. The front gate was heavily armed, and so we went out the gate at Pine Street. There used to be a wonderful restaurant there, which is now just a house. It served best hamburgers in town, and a beer, 25 cents. Boyd, Huff, and I were hustled on down to Cannery Row. It was a pretty nice walk, but it was a September evening. And we knocked at the door at number 800, and Ed answered. He was surprised to see us, but he was very hospitable. He asked us in. So we went in. None of us had any money in those days. I was a private, made $50. Boyd Huff was a sergeant. He made $55, I think, or $60. And Ed would have made about $55 a month. So you see, we were in the chips. And that's all we could afford, a beer and chips. We went across the street to the Wing Chong market. It was called Wing Chong in Cannery Row, but the old Chinese gentleman that ran it was Lee Chong. I was astounded when I walked into the store to find that they had firecrackers for sale, Christmas lights, Halloween masks, for sale all year round. They also had a meat market, vegetables, everything under the sun. Steinbeck in Cannery Row describes the store as not a model of neatness, but a miracle of supply. If you want to check that, that's page 9. We bought a couple of bottles of Burgermeister beer, 35 cents a piece. That was for a double bottle. A couple of bags of potato chips, this big, for 10 cents each, and went back over and ate the chips and drank the beer. But that was the first time I had been at 800 Cannery Row. I never dreamed I would be one of the owners of it many, many years later. But my friendship with Ed was remarkable. He was easy to know. He was a great guy, a great host. Very cool, very calm, soft-spoken. He spoke with actually a hint of Midwestern accent, in that it was his voice was a little dry, I might describe it. He was 5'7". I remember him as being 10'8".